Welcome to Denver, Colorado. I guess I'm at a conference. I can't see or hear anyone, so that's an interesting experience. We are going to talk about why CSS is rad. If you're like me, you maybe spend a lot of time in the browser working in CSS, and you've probably seen a meme like this that implies that CSS maybe isn't that awesome. So we're just going to fix that quick. Done. Any questions? I think that should basically cover the talk we're giving. I actually want to jump back to 1989 and the start of the World Wide Web project at CERN. This is Tim Berners-Lee working with a team at CERN. But myself in 1989, not that interested in tech, really planning to become an artist. In fact, the next year I published my debut novel, this Choose Your Own Adventure, The Mystery of the Missing Art Box, followed up very quickly by The Sward. I couldn't afford a copy editor for that one, but the start of my artistic career there. And I went on to study theater and run a theater company for several years. And one of the things that I really love about theater is that lots of different companies, even the same company multiple times, can take the same script and produce it in a wide variety of different ways. And so there's this really interesting sort of like core of the art piece that is the same every time. The words that are said on stage, if we can remember them. But then there's a lot that's really different and can be dramatically different. Oh, that's a pun I didn't intend, sorry. But I really love that sense. And I used a methodology from Anne Bogart called viewpoints, which is sort of like the agile startup approach for theaters, an experimental way of thinking about performance and of taking the words and performing them in really interesting new ways. And she has a lot of great quotes. Well, one that sticks with me is always her sense that art should have room for the audience to move around, to imagine and make associations. We're not trying to make everybody feel the same thing at the same time in exactly the same ways. We're trying to give them associations and let every individual have a different experience of it. Now, at some point, our theater company needed a website. And so I contacted my brother, who was already a developer, and I asked him if he could build me a website, and he said no. But he offered to teach me how to do it. So he sent me to Eric Meyer's CSS Edge experiments. I'm just going to go there quick. Eric still has it up. And it has all these old CSS tricks that were just fascinating, like this. There's no actual transparency on this. He's using a combination of different fixed images to make it look like there's transparency, all sorts of neat tricks like that that got me really interested in what was going on here. And then from there, I linked off to the CSS Zen Garden and saw this one HTML file with so many different beautiful designs. And that struck me as similar to this theater thing I was doing where we have a script and then we do different performances of it. And the idea that we could do different performances of the same script and even switch using a little menu. The first website that I built, I did that. I had like 6 different style sheets and you could choose which style because this whole thing seemed like a weird performance art project to me. And it's sort of the only reason I'm here is I got super obsessed with this weird performance art thing that CSS can do. But let's jump back to 1989. So the World Wide Web project is starting and they launched their first website, and you can still go to the first website. It's still here and it still works on my modern browser. We've got some sort of forwards compatibility there. But along with that first website, they also released the first browser, the World Wide Web Hypermedia Browser. It's a browser and an editor. We can actually go to the emulator that's been built for that and see it in action. So I can go to Document, Open from a full reference. That menu doesn't close by default. Let's say we'll just go to the Oddbird website. This is our modern current website. And there it is, totally available. There's a few things that don't translate well. like these and NBSP, these non-breaking spaces we have in there. But for the most part, all of our content is there. Oh, hi, I'm Miriam. So also backwards compatible in some sense. The first browser can still load my current website. If you dig around on that site for a bit, you find this quote: "It's required that HTML be a common language between all platforms." And this is sort of central to the entire idea of the web. We're not just creating a new operating system, a new medium that's going to be on specific devices. We're creating something that's supposed to go everywhere, and that ends up becoming the mission statement of the W3C once it's formed several years later. Web for all, web on everything. And that means everything, which right away, the first browser was built for the next machine, so we have a problem. We can't just support the next machine. We have to also support an old IBM terminal with green text on a black background. So right away, they develop the second browser, and it feels like a step backwards in some sense, but it proves the point. It proves that we're going to support everyone everywhere, not just people on the latest devices. So we can also go to the emulator for this one. Nicola Pello built this browser initially. It has no graphic interface. I can't click on anything. I have to type in the numbers. So I'm going to go to technical there. That's number 19. And then I think I want to go to HTML format, number 4, go to the next page, and constraints 12. And down at the bottom of this page, and I can't blow up this page, so I'll go back to my slides. But down at the bottom of that page, you can find this implies no device-specific markup or anything which requires control over fonts or colors. That's what we get if we're trying to support every browser everywhere, and it makes sense. How are we going to support fonts and colors when some devices don't have them? But this is really a radical shift in the way that we're thinking about creating and shipping content. I don't know if Gutenberg what his mission statement would have been for the printing press if mission statements were popular in 1440, but I don't think that this was the idea. And when I work on print design, I can jump into InDesign. I can design a book cover for my friend's book. I choose the fonts, I choose the colors, and several months later, I get the book in the mail. Here it is. It's exactly what I designed. And it's exactly the same for everybody that buys the book, right? It's the same size, it's the same fonts, it's the same colors. Everybody gets exactly the same thing. They get the same type size inside, the same weight of book. There's no variation. We've created it, we've shipped it. But on the web, everything is variable. The size, not just of the view screen, but of the text. Interfaces are different, whether we're interacting through keyboard and mouse or through touch or gestures in the air or speaking commands. The content is different. Often we're working with CMSs where we don't control the content. The features that are available on different browsers and different devices are different. So we can design on this big 4K monitor, but then we're shipping to just a massive number of mobile devices, from laptops down to phones, down to watches, and now smart speakers reading the web to us, and assistive devices, Braille readers, and headphones. And all of this, the platform is supposed to be forwards, backwards, and sideways compatible, just compatible absolutely everywhere. And in order to get there, that first website says, how we're going to do that is we're just going to let browsers ignore our code. So browsers can ignore tags which they don't understand, and ignore attributes that they don't understand on tags that they do. So down to the smallest level, browsers can just ignore something that they don't understand and use whatever they do understand. And that leaves us with just so many variables from that we can't take into account. We can't design something specifically for every single one of those devices and every single combination of devices and preferences and all sorts of things. And there's only one part of this system that knows that full context, and it's the browser. The browser knows what device it's on, what the device capabilities are, what the screen size is, what the user preferences are, and what code we've shipped. So the browser right there in the middle is the only piece of the system that can put it all together in a smart way. So I think we've been understating this for a long time. We've been saying that websites don't need to look the same in every browser. But the truth is, websites cannot possibly look the same in every browser. There is no fundamental way for websites to look the same. In fact, control over fonts and colors is impossible, and we should all go home. But these browser differences are a feature of the system, not a bug. They're built in. This is how it's designed. Browsers are supposed to be different. They're supposed to handle things differently. That's the entire point. The fact that we can control the paper page is really a limitation of this medium. It doesn't adapt to context in the way that the web can. And if you haven't read A Tao of Web Design from way back in 2000, I highly recommend it. It was another of those articles that really got me following this thread into CSS development. But there's a problem here, because we all know fonts and colors are great, and everybody wanted them, not just authors, but authors wanted to be able to express something creative, do layouts, do design, show what their brand was, things like that. But users also wanted a more diverse experience on the web, a more visually interesting experience. So everybody wants this fonts and colors thing to work. And HTML, if it can't control fonts and colors, we're eliminating all this visual creativity, and that's a problem. So in '93, Mosaic comes out and is the first browser that's sort of widely used. You might remember mention of Mark Anderson from Henry's talk. Mark is behind the Mosaic browser. He adds that image tag, and you can see here, it's used to start styling text, to start doing fonts and colors that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. But that brings up some other issues besides just complexity. As Hao-Kwon Lee says, the web would have become a giant fax machine where pictures of text would be passed along. Basically, websites started turning into just images, static images of text with the fonts and colors, and that's a problem for the language. And this was actually considered sort of an existential threat to HTML. If images are the only way to do style and everybody's using them for that. So there's sort of this race around 1993 to figure out a styling solution that's going to work across all these devices. And you can go to the style history page of the W3C, and you can see all the different proposals here. We're going to look at some of these first three, but you can look through all of them. They're super interesting, lots of different proposals for how we might do style sheets. One of the early ones is from Pei Wei. He proposes a style sheet language that he actually implements in the Viola browser. It's a little bit of a niche browser because it only works on certain operating systems, but it's the first browser to have a style sheet language in it. And the language looks something like this. So we can see familiar elements here. We've got selectors and then blocks of them. We've even got nesting of selectors. And then we have property and value pairs, the declarations, font size, background color, foreground color. So that looks familiar, but not exactly what we got. And he notes that the properties are inherited. So unless we override them, something farther down the tree is going to inherit styles from higher up in the tree. And this will drastically simplify what we have to write. We don't have to write every style over and over. We can inherit a lot of it, and this sort of compresses what we're having to say in our style sheets. Around the same time, actually slightly earlier, Robert Reich also had a proposal that he refers to as an easily parsable format. I assume he's talking about the computer parsing it, because I find this somewhat difficult to parse. But there's similar elements here. We've got selectors, selector block here. You UL and the LI, and default, this is like our star selector. And then it seems like a selector block is just until you get to the next selector. And we've got these grouped sort of real shorthand styles that we're setting. And if we expand those out, uncompress them, we get FO parens FA equals TI means font family times, obviously. But he very quickly clarifies, this is not meant to be times exactly. We're suggesting the type of font that we want. We want something times-like. And the browser is going to have to make that choice based on what fonts are actually available on the device. Similarly, font size 14 has no units. He referred to these as general units. The browser should be making the decision of what that unit actually means. We're just giving them a suggestion that they can work with relative to other things. So he uses this language of suggestions or hints over and over. Styles are suggestions or hints about behavior. They're not rules. Hints and suggestions, he says it in all caps. We're trying to allow the browsers to make appropriate decisions based on our intent. So we need to convey intent. But in 1994, again, Mark Andreessen releases a new browser called Netscape, and he was not into this style sheets idea. He wanted it all to be a single language. So we got the center tag, the multicol tag, the font tag, and all of them here in HTML. But the problem is, if you want the same style again, you have to repeat the tag again and again and again and again. There's none of the sort of clever ways of, well, pulling it out of HTML, but also inheriting and selecting multiple things at once. Now, in 1994, I still was not paying attention, although my brothers and I suppose maybe this was like getting used to doing a client card sort or something. So I'll refer to this as an early Oddbird meeting. But meanwhile, Halcombe Lee was paying attention to the web, and he proposed cascading HTML style sheets. Actually, I think within days of Netscape coming out. We've dropped HTML from that, but this is the initial proposal for the language that we use today. And again, he's using some of this same language that Robert Reich used and some of the ideas from Pei Wei. But he also has another concern here that he's very focused on in the document, trying to soften the tension between author and reader. And he describes that tension as the author wanting to be distinct and unique and have a brand and express creativity. Authors want a distinct look and feel. Users are going to set preferences that make things more similar. And he's not saying users want everything to look identical, but users might have a preference of font size that they find legible. They might like dark mode more than light mode. Users may have various preferences that they're going to want every site to conform to in some way. And that's going to make things more similar. So we're going to somehow balance those constraints, those two desires. So in order to balance that, he wants to give authors and users the same notation. And that means that we're going to attach multiple styles to a document, which is going to give the browser this ordered list or cascade of style sheets. The cascade comes from that. We're going to have multiple style sheets. We're going to have to resolve conflicts between them. How are we going to do that? So the user and browser are going to specify initial preferences and hand the remaining influence over to the document. That's us, the authors of the document. So sort of two steps there. And if conflicts arise, the user should have the final word because they're the ones that know best what they need in order to read this. But authors should be able to attach style hints. They should be able to suggest something. And I think his plan here is just awesomely audacious. It's so weird and radical, but he suggests that we give a weighted influence on every style. So the user can come along and say, I want the H1 font size to be 16 points, and I care about that 60%. And then the author comes along and says, I want H1 font size at 24 points, And I care about that 100%. But because the user came first, the user takes priority. The user gets their 60%, the author is reduced to 40%, and we do this weighted averaging, and we get 19.2 points. The weighted average between their two concerns based on how much they care. What? I love this. So I started playing with it. It's not something that we have exactly, but I thought we could sort of fake this. So let's go to the Firefox style editor here. And we're just going to say that the user's font size, whoops, back to the style editor. The user's font size is represented by 1M. That's the font size that we're inheriting from the user styles. Let's say that we want a 3M font size. That's very large, but there it is. So we can do that. We can just take over control like that. Or instead, we could develop some sort of algorithm where we put in a user size of 1M and an author size of 3M. We're going to represent those in CSS variables. And then we're going to set a weight here. And we won't dig through this math, but that's how we find the average. And then we'll apply the average. So here we go with the user getting a weight of 60. And we can change the author size. We can say instead, let's use pixels, 24 pixels, and there's 60%. If we did user weight of 0, it'd be fully author size, and they're fully user size. Anyway, I don't know that that's a good idea or anything we need to do, but I just wanted to play with it. And it felt like at first when I was reading this, like we lost this entire weighted averages idea. And in some ways we did. We don't get averages, but this basically turned into normal styles and important styles. So important styles are 100%, normal styles are 0%, and important styles always win. I mean, taking this further, he proposed weighted, we could do entire weighted style sheets, and this is directly from his proposal. Let's pull in the New York Times style sheet at 30%, and the Le Monde style sheet at 70%, and just merge those two with a weighted average and see what we get. I tried it. There was no way to do averages, but I pulled in their two style sheets. Not very interesting. And the reason is, at that point, they were thinking mostly of styling individual elements. And basically, we don't do that anymore. We usually are styling classes and attributes and IDs. So the styles that get put on the individual elements are usually just sort of reset styles, and there's not a lot of conflict there. But in his mind, and again, this is ASCII art directly from his proposal to the W3C mailing list, is that we could have sliders that a user could determine for every site what different weight they want for every aspect of the page, how much they want their own styles, how much they want the author styles, and where exactly between those. I love this. This is such weird performance art. This is awesome. But this is the beginnings of Cascade origins. This is the first step in the Cascade before we get to specificity is where does the style come from? And there's three origins built in initially: user agent or browser, the user, and the author. That's us. So starting with the user agent is providing defaults, and they're just trying to make a site readable. So they're going to apply like basic list styles, basic heading styles, paragraph styles, table styles, things that are going to work as a general default. In Firefox, we can actually see that style sheet by going to resource, GRE resources. There's lots of resources here. My favorite is probably the broken image. This image is not broken. This is how it looks. But there's also html.css, and that's what we're looking for. This is the internal styles applied to every website by Firefox. First, there's some bidirectional Unicode issues that are resolved, and then we set display block on all of these block elements. And the reason is the spec provides a default for the display property, and that's inline. If a browser doesn't know the display of something, it always defaults to inline. So The browser has to provide this for legibility, or we would have one long block of text that's hard to read. So the browser puts in display. If we scroll through here, we can see they play with selectors that most people aren't using in production yet. And Firefox can do that because they know this style sheet's not going to be used by anybody except for them. So as long as they have support, it's going to work. They're also able to use quite complex selectors and, in fact, important. They're able to use this. And in some ways, it's interesting. They can use as high specificity as they want, as complex of selectors as they want, because these origins are going to layer in the cascade. That's the point. We can actually see, play around with some of this to see the difference between, here's the Oddbird website. I'll go into the style editor again, create a new one, and let's just say star all initial. And initial takes us back to the spec. So there we go. There's everything set to initial, as though the browser and us weren't allowed to apply any styles to it. If we actually want to revert to the browser styles, we can use revert, and we can see, it'll take a second there, we can see that now we get the browser's styling of block level elements, some margins between things, headings are bigger, and it's a bit more readable. We still got a lot of junk in there that makes it a little less readable, but they're applying list styles, all sorts of things that are going to help with that. So that's the difference between revert and initial. Initial is going back to the specification, everything's going to be inline. Revert is going back to the browser or user. So on top of browser defaults, we get user preferences. These initially were written in CSS. That's still possible in some browsers, but in most browsers, we would now handle them with preferences. But they work the same way. We just sort of have a limited set here of preferences that we can choose from. But we can bump up our font size to 40. And if we look back at our slides, they are now much larger. And we'll just put that back to 16. But the user gets all sort of controls here. And some of those controls, they're able to set some colors. They're also able to say always override the colors of the author. So the user actually has a lot of control if they want it. And that's user styles. That's the second origin. And then we get author styles. That's us. So for author styles, we're providing the document styles. We know what that is. So these get stacked on top of each other. And as you can see, the user agent goes first, then the user, then the author. So we win in any conflicts, but that's not what he wanted. In Haukon's idea was that the user should always win. And that's where important comes into play. This is the real reason for importance. Anytime someone adds important to a style, we create 3 new origins, and they're the important origins, and they go in reverse order. So it's sort of this snake draft of user agent goes first and last, and our 2 layers are right there in the middle next to each other, which is why we don't think about this often when we're using important, because our styles don't jump that far up the stack. But browsers and users can use this to override us. There's a couple more origins that are automatically generated, but we're not going to dig into them. Haukon also was talking about media queries right away in that first proposal. A speech media query for changing decibels. One of my favorites, this age media query, the age of the document. If the document is more than 3 days old, turn the background yellow. I love that. Having our documents degrade on the web, that's beautiful. That's performance art. He also had this idea for like a more relevant article might get a bigger headline. That's an interesting media query, but also there's sort of a relative units thing in there. The H1 font size is set to times equals 1.5. You might recognize that from some other languages. It makes the font 1.5 times the font size, which ends up becoming M units, basically. We don't times equals, we just 1.5 M, and we get the same idea. But this whole thing is designed to be resilient and to fail beautifully. And in the same way that HTML browsers and parsers are allowed to ignore anything they don't understand, the same is true in CSS. So if a browser doesn't understand a selector, it ignores everything inside of it. And if a browser doesn't understand a declaration, it falls back to the previous declaration. So we can actually do these things where we define the same property multiple times. And if a browser doesn't understand grid, it will fall back to flex. And if it doesn't understand flex, it will fall back to the browser default of block. And that's useful for us. And Jen Simmons calls this quantum CSS. We can use code and not use it at the same time. When we apply that display grid, that will work in some browsers and not in other browsers. And it is in this quantum state of being supported and not supported. So we can't talk about browser support of features as a binary. It's not yes or no, browsers do or don't support grid. Browsers, some do, some don't. So we have this sense that we can jump into can I use and look at these numbers for grid support and tell right away, we just, can I use is trying to give us this sense of complexity with some things are partial green, there's a percentage up here, but we often try to simplify this to a yes or no answer by cutting out some browsers and saying, okay, let's only pay attention to some of these browsers and we'll ignore the others, and then we'll use it if all of our supported browsers can handle it. But that's not how the web works. That's not how this was intended to go. And we already know how to handle this sort of thing, not only because product designers have been designing for adaptation and user preferences for years, and we have this sort of thing built in even to the language with font stacks. I'm not sure why font family is the only property to have this sort of built in, but very handy. Built into the language, this sense that if a browser doesn't understand your favorite font, it falls back to the next and down to the least specific. But also because we've been doing responsive web design since 2010, and it's the same idea, just expanded to be more than just viewports. And when we do responsive design, we're not rewriting everything for every individual viewport. That would be absurd. We can't target each of these devices individually. So we have these too many variables to consider. So we don't want to worry about all of the different variables. We want the browser to make smart choices for us. And we do that by sort of hitting main target areas, writing smart code, and then moving between them and seeing where things break and making small tweaks where it breaks. And we don't need to load up every single device to do that. We can just resize our screen and get a sense. So how do we code for resilience? I'm going to talk about 5 different ways, I guess, in very short time. One is to trust the flow. Trust that the browser is able to make smart decisions for us and is designed to do that. Define some constraints and let the language work out the details. So that starts with normal flow. Normal flow is sort of a new name for an old thing, which is the default layout of the web with block and inline elements. Block elements stack, inline elements wrap, and everything flows, which is pretty cool and not something that other design tools do. And it's actually where we run into this sort of problem, where the question is, why does this honk right out of the box? And the answer is because we're over specifying and we need to trust the flow a little bit more. So we can jump in and we can say, okay, what if instead of a max width of 3.5n, we said min content? That would be one way to solve this. Another would be changing the overflow. Let's change overflow to scroll. And there, now we've got a different sort of solution. We get actually quite a bit of power on how words wrap, how things overflow, that we don't get in other tools. InDesign, if you try to do InDesign is awesome, you get this, the word just totally disappears. And I don't know how this would be a better solution for the web. CSS is designed to not lose data for us. And that's why the default overflow is visible. so that we don't lose information like this. Whereas InDesign doesn't have to worry about that because we'll come back to it, we'll fix it before we go to print. I hope we have a proofreader. So another option is to just let it fail. And there are lots of different places we can do this. I've pulled some of them together into this demo. So we've got different figures here. Each one has an image and a caption, and the image is floated. And so one of the clearest examples of just letting it fail is border radius. These days, border radius is supported basically everywhere. But when it first came out, the idea was you add border radius, and if a browser doesn't support it, they get square corners. Everything is still okay with the world. These square corners aren't going to damage anything. And you'll notice that I didn't go looking for a browser that doesn't support border radius. Because browsers can just ignore things, we can also test by just ignoring them. So I just comment out border radius and I can see what the fallback is. I don't need to do a lot of extra testing for that. Markers, this is styling the list markers. We can turn those red and see the list markers change. This is supported by very few browsers, and we can test what happens in the browsers that don't support it. It's fine. It's not going to harm anything in most cases for them not to get a red color there. Similarly, shape outside. And here, I usually start when I'm playing with shape outside, I start with just sort of a rectangle definition and then go into the dev tools where there's a shape editor, and I can grab these points and just start moving them around. Double click to get a new point there. Move that where I want it, adjust. All right, let's go back to our style editor. It's updated there. And again, we can test what happens in browsers that don't support shape outside just by commenting out that code. That fallback, again, is fine. Then there's many more places we can do this. Text decoration on links. We can play with those features. We're going to need to do some other things here to get that looking right, but I'm not going to go into detail on that. We're going to go back to the slides. The idea is for many things, we can provide styles to more advanced browsers without worrying what happens on an older browser. Another example of this is full height sections of a page and how we deal with that. So this is something that I use all the time. We'll go into the style editor, see the demo here. And basically, we're getting this whole full height hero image just with display flex and height 100 VH. Now, what's going to happen on browsers that don't support these? So we can check that. If we turn off 100 VH, that collapses quite a bit. So let's add in a little bit of padding on the H1. Or actually, we could do the padding here on the header. We'll give it 3 Ms. And maybe nothing on the cross axis. 3 M's not enough. I bet 3 M's would be enough on that. We can play around depending on exactly what we need. So there we've basically solved that height 100 VH issue. We're not going to get full screen, but we're going to get something that still feels like it has the space we need. Now we can also test with flex off and either with or without 100 VH. Either way, it looks like all we really need here is to text align, whoops, text align center. And, oh, table align, great. This is the fun part about live coding. So there we go. Now if flex or height isn't supported, we get a reasonable fallback, and there we go. And there's many places that we can use that. I use it all over this slide deck itself. Another is source order fallback, which is really handy for subgrids. And I have a demo here. I don't think I have time to go into it in detail, but we can apply subgrid and still apply templates behind that and just rely on the source order to fall back. I suppose I should, whoops, I don't want to go into it here. This There we go. So in our style editor, we maybe get a mock-up that is showing us everything the same and it looks great. But if we actually switch over to cards that are different, we've got live content, everything is a little different. We want to clean that up some. And we can do that. Let's add in just some rows inside of those cards just to space things a little bit better. And then if we want to get this subgrids thing, we want to change the overall grid so that each of these is spanning 3 items, and those 3 items are going to be the 3 elements inside, the 3 chunks of each card. And we're going to space those so that the top and bottom are auto, and the middle is going to take up the remaining space. And if we add that, we can see the cards. Well, nothing really changed there because we need each of the cards to span those 3 rows. Now they're spanning those rows, but they're each on their individual grid. Those grids aren't aligning. And we can fix that with subgrid. And if subgrid isn't supported, we fall back to that. That's fine. With subgrid, we're going to want to get rid of some of that gap, that's extra space. But here we're relying on the fact that grid template rows, no, this one, grid template rows subgrid. If that's not there, we're falling back to this grid template rows, auto 1 fraction auto, and that's going to be good enough. So we also get things like support queries. It works exactly like a media query where we can say @supports and then what we're looking for, and then the code we want to run if it's supported. We can use that to very quickly create fallbacks for grids. We can quickly create a grid layout and a fallback for it using just a little bit of @supports. And I'm going to go into this because I think it's important. I think people have been avoiding grids, and grids are so fast and so powerful that with just a little bit of fallback code, we should be able to make them work. So I'm going to start here with some of the grid code. I'm going to say, here's the grid I'm creating. Whoops. Each of those lines individually. Min height 100 VH. That's just going to make sure that we always take up the full viewport. Display grid. Nothing really changed there because it's very similar to block layout. And then grid gap 1M, just to give some space between them. And let's do this ASCII art grid definition where we describe a header, nav, main, and footer areas and how they should share space. The main should be able to take up extra space. And then this gives us a good mobile layout, but we want something different at 40 ems. Say we're going to change the definition of the grid. And this is where grid is so powerful. We can change that definition in one place and everything just moves to fit. Okay, so right now they're taking up the areas not based on their names. So we need to assign each one to an area. And here we've got header, header across, nav main, and then nav footer. And if we look, we can very quickly change the layout. We can say, let's do the footer the whole way across. Cool. And for a fallback for this, we just need to turn off display grid and we see our fallback. So we're going to want a little bit of margin there between things. And the navigation is going to float left and get a width on it and a little bit of margin. And on main, we'll do overflow so that they're taking up separate space. And we're doing that at the media query also. So maybe that's going to want to be a max width. We can adjust things like that. I don't think we want a max width. All right. And then we can use @supports just to clean up the difference between them. @supports, display, grid, anything that supports that, any browser that supports that declaration will use this code. The first thing we're going to want to do, so now grid is supported. Now we've got a few issues to clean up. We'll remove that double gap that we've created. Oh, I did that again. So we remove that double gap. That's great. And we'll have to clean up a few things on the nav. We can ignore the floats because they're already ignored. we can unset the width, and we can unset the margin right. And now we get our grid layout working. And if we want to test the fallback, now we have to ignore both the supports and display grid, and we can see our floated fallback. So again, very quickly, we can create the grid layout that's quite a bit simpler, and then the fallback that we want for it. We get the similar thing with support selector. We can use that to check selectors like the marker selector, and lots of other media queries beyond just checking the browser width. We get preference queries where we can check if a user prefers a color scheme, prefers a contrast ratio, prefers reduced motion. We get interface queries like checking for hover and pointer types, where we can target specifically what's going to happen depending on the type of interface being used. We have these tools and we have this knowledge to do what is supposed to be impossible, to do fonts and colors on the web, which shouldn't be possible across just unknown content, infinite and unknown canvases, operating systems, interfaces, languages. This is an absurd thing that we're doing. And it is kind of like this live theater idea where we can write a script, we can even write stage directions, what we intended. We're conveying to the producers what we intended this production to look like. But every production has to make it's going to be totally unique. It's going to have different actors, different sets, different budgets. And they're going to have to make individual choices and ignore some of our stage directions. And we get this choose your own adventure mystery of the missing art box. And to go back to Anne Bogart, it takes craft to set up the circumstances that are simple, to define those simple constraints, but leave room for the ambiguities and incongruity of human experience or, say, devices and browsers on the web. We need to embrace this sense of quantum browser support, of supporting and not supporting browsers at the same time, of letting the web fail beautifully the way it was intended, and caring about people, the people that we can reach on different devices, rather than some concept of a perfect implementation of a mock-up. This is fundamentally radical and fundamentally user-centered way of thinking about design. And CSS is the only language that exists that's trying to deal with this reality of a flexible, multilingual, multi-web device. So when people say CSS is weird or broken, it's solving a harder problem than any other language is trying to solve. I recommend checking out the Layoutland Resilient videos by Jen Simmons. She goes into more detail on some of these demos that I had to brush through. I also have various other resources here you can check out, and Oddbird provides all sorts of consulting around this. But that's it, thank you. CSS is fundamentally radical because it's doing just the hardest thing we can imagine, right?
Cool. Oh, you were quick getting over here, Miriam. No messing about. Love it. I think people are arriving as well. So just a reminder to people as they do arrive, I'm keeping an eye on the chat here in the session here. If you want to pop questions in there, I've also got an eye. I don't know why I'm pointing. It doesn't matter to you where my windows are, but I'm also keeping an eye on Slack as well in the live channel in case questions go in there. But now we can just have a bit of a chat. But well, there's so many lovely kind of sentiments and principles in that talk, Miriam. I love. I mean, you kind of started off just by saying everything is variable, which certainly has been my experience when trying to make something look exactly how I want it in every scenario. Before we get into anything else, I need to ask you this question: is CSS code?
Sure.
Yeah.
I kind of don't care. I mean, like, there's the whole, like, is CSS a programming language? And I think I care in the sense that that's usually used to dismiss CSS programmers.
Right.
But other than that, I don't care about the answer. What matters to me is that CSS is so fundamentally radical and doing something that no other programming language is even trying to do. And I think that's the point.
Fair. Very good. Okay, fair enough. When it comes to the web, I think you kind of illustrated just how flexible it is and how unpredictable it is. You create things in lots of different mediums yourself. Do you think the web is unique in that regard? I mean, is there any other medium you can think of that even comes close to that?
In terms of that flexibility,
just
I mean,
like the unknowability as well. It's like the kind of, it's impacted so much by the viewer rather than the user.
no, I mean, offhand, I can't think of anything exactly. I mean, it's sort of like, it has aspects of live theater to it, but even in live theater, I choose a venue. Usually, I mean, I can do street art. I've done that, but still, all of the audience there are seeing the same street art. There's not sort of the same individual control. There's individual associations. There's that room to move that Anne Bogart talks about, but yeah, I don't think there is another language or medium quite like it.
I was struggling to think as well. As you kind of got my cogs turning thinking about that, because it certainly feels like over the years I've worked in places where we've treated the web like the digital version of another medium. It's like, oh well, it's like we'll apply print design principles to it, or various principles to it, and I find that's kind of one of the hardest obstacles to overcome. It's like, how do we convince? I mean, I don't want to bash on any discipline, but how do we? I was about to say designers, but that's not. To be honest, that's not fair, because it's every stakeholder and discipline up until like the point of touching the medium. I think we bring some hangovers of other mediums there. So, is that solvable? Do you think we can get past that?
I would say maybe. I mean, the web is so young, and if you think about like what Gutenberg was 1440, and before that, we're hand painting our documents, and there's just probably some carryover there, and struggle to make that shift from, say, illuminated scripts to printed texts. But now we've been dealing with printed design for how many years since 1440? Right. And we're only less than 30 years into the web as a medium, and even fewer for CSS. I mean, it was around 2000 is when it really started to be supported in a browser. And that's Internet Explorer. For anybody that loves hating on Internet Explorer and CSS, it was the first to do it. The problem was just that it didn't update after that. But 20 years that we've been doing this, and that is not much time.
Yeah,
to learn it.
In that perspective, yeah. But so much has changed in that time as well. I mean, it feels like not only the canvas that we're painting on in terms of like the devices, but also the brushes we're painting with in terms of like the technology and just what CSS itself can do. That's iterating so quickly, right? And
there was a big shift somewhere in there from the sense that, okay, we're counting on browsers to fail. That's an intentional part of the system. Is this failure being built in? But in the first draft of CSS, we just sort of relied on browsers to figure out what that meant. And at some point we went back and said, this is how to fail, so that browsers are failing in a consistent way. And that really makes a big difference in what we're able to do in terms of managing that variety. We're still relying on that failure, which means it's still going to be really different everywhere. But at least we can count on a consistent way of it falling back.
Yeah, and you talk about fallbacks, quite a lot, and I've always been a really big fan of progressive enhancement, and it feels to me like that's almost gone a little bit out of vogue recently. Is that your observation as well? You look like you have feelings.
I mean, I think it's complicated because we have to think about what we mean by that. And often there's sort of a tension between the idea of progressive enhancement and the idea of frameworks. And these frameworks are allowing us to do a lot of things, and they're also making it so more of our sites and apps rely on JavaScript to run. But progressive enhancement has always been, again, sort of a balancing of trade-offs. And so I don't know if part of the issue is that we thought about progressive enhancement too black and white, and we need to think about like how are we balancing these trade-offs? How are we making this decision site by site, app by app? But I agree. I mean, I actually, I was thinking about this recently and asked one of our developers offered to look into like what's the modern take on progressive enhancement, and he couldn't find anything more recent than 2015 or something.
Really?
And we were like, that's okay. People aren't writing about this. What's going on? So yeah, I'd be interested to see if we can bring that back and what it means now and how we talk about it now.
Yeah, it'd be lovely if it turned out that the reason we just haven't mentioned it since 2015 is it's just completely.
We got it done.
We just accepted it. We just accept it. We don't need to talk about it anymore. But we don't talk about plugging our computers in when we're going to write code.
But also, I mean, that's sort of what happened with responsive design, right? I mean, we don't talk about it a lot anymore because it became ingrained. And actually now we're in some ways moving past it. Responsive design was technically this like percentages for everything. And that's intentionally removing intrinsic width from everything. So this is where Jen Simmons talks about intrinsic web design being the next step, where now we can actually create grids based on intrinsic values like min width, max width, or min content, max content, things like that. So, but I do think about like the way responsive web design, mobile first was a term of art for that, and that is describing the process of progressive enhancement. Start small, build up, make sure it works small, build up, and we can take those same ideas and apply them to resilience in addition to simply viewport responsiveness. We can still start small, build up.
Yeah, right. And I think there's a term that I heard Stephen Hay use when talking about kind of planning responsive design. I think he talks about content choreography, which is a term I really enjoyed when I was thinking about how content flows around the screen depending on different scenarios and kind of leading to planning content hierarchy. And it was kind of in my mind a little bit while you were talking then, but also because while you were giving your presentation, there was a little kind of theme that kind of broke out in the chat where someone responded to something you said, and it broke into a conversation of people pulling their hair out, trying to how can we convince clients that this doesn't have to look the same everywhere? And you could tell there was a bit of group therapy happening right there in the chat. But you've mentioned in several ways about we should let things fail beautifully. Nothing is, everything is variable, all those kind of things. I imagine that you've had these conversations with people a lot about trying to convince them that things don't have to look the same everywhere. Have you found particular methods of being successful in that debate, if it is even a debate?
Yeah, I think I take different approaches with different clients, and a lot of our clients were building sort of internal apps. So what really matters is that whatever browsers they're using, we make sure it doesn't look broken. And then they're often not comparing with each other. So, as long as all of them feel like it's working for them, we're not getting complaints. There's probably a little bit more concern if we were doing marketing sites, which I haven't done a lot of with clients recently. But that's where I always remember it being a little harder to convince them that this is going to look different everywhere. I mean, there are some tricks we use, like we never show a fully high fidelity static comp to a client ever. They will never see that until they see it in the browser. So we'll show them bits and pieces of it, or often our designers will they'll have a high fidelity comp because they need it to sort of understand what they're trying to do and the decisions they're making. But when we need to show something to a client, they'll select all, change it to black and white, and change it to a handwritten font. And we'll show that. And we've actually had, the first client we did that with, he thanked us when we started doing that. He was like, thank you, I was so distracted by these other things. I wasn't looking at what you wanted me to look at. It's helped us focus in. And it also means that there is no, in the client's mind, we haven't set up what the perfect design is or what the expected design everywhere is. So when they see it in the browser, that's perfect. That's the finished thing.
That. Yeah, I love that kind of helping them focus on the thing that you're trying to discuss at the time, which is the structure and the behavior and all of those other things, rather than what exactly should this drop shadow look like.
Exactly.
And then but I particularly like the fact that you're then showing them that visual treatment at the point that they're looking at in the medium as they experience it, because you're clicking straight to that. That's clever.
We actually do that in terms of designer-developer collaboration too, very similar to what Dan Mull talked about, where I wouldn't say that we use exactly a hot potato approach, but it's similar, where at the end, I usually want designers to also give me a rough sketch. And then I'll go back to them once I've developed that rough sketch, and we'll sit and we'll talk about how does it move, and fallbacks are we using, and exactly we'll do the finishing touches together, or with some back and forth at the end. So even for us, there's not a final design being sent to the developers that's that they're going to have to implement exactly in every browser. Yeah.
When it comes to sustaining CSS over time, I don't want to speak for everyone, but my CSS is perfect from the day I started on a blank piece of paper to the end of a project. It's a shit show by the end, very, very quickly for me. And I think that's a challenge that lots of people have, right? Trying to be structured and organized and what have you. Do you battle the same thing, or have you? You've cracked a good set of techniques for keeping things organized?
Well, I feel like it's the same techniques that we have to use in other languages. Like when I think about it, the same thing happens with my JavaScript. It becomes a tangled mess if I'm not careful about maintaining what's interacting with what and how exactly. And we just need to give that same attention to CSS. And I feel like it always seems to me that I'm doing the same thing in both languages. What's the problem people are having? And I can only assume it's that we don't hire people with CSS knowledge or pay them. Like that has to be it, right? Because what it takes is the time to make sure things are organized, make sure we're maintaining the patterns. And we can do that in a design system or a component library, but somebody still has to maintain that. We have to put in that time. So my CSS gets out of hand when I'm in a hurry, and I get it under control when I have a little time to get it under control.
Yeah. For some reason, it seems like CSS is one of the last things to get refactored, because I guess it reaches into so many, into other places in different ways. So yeah, interesting. I couldn't help
preprocessors to help with that. I mean, I think that's sort of, people talk about preprocessors as though they'll go away once we have all the right features in CSS, and I don't think it's true. I mean, sort of in the way that servers haven't gone away. There's still room for logic that's pre-compiled and logic that's compiled on the client. And both of those are useful, and they have different purposes. And so I use Sass to organize everything and keep my tokens organized in similar to what Big Medium Josh was showing yesterday.
I was so late to the party with Sass. I rejected for such a long time the idea of a preprocessor there, and I cannot defend that decision at all now. But I always felt like I wanted to have greater control. I don't know why. I seem to be happy now to introduce build tools there, but I'm worried now that people are going to move away from Sass and say, well, we've got CSS variables and we can do all of these things in CSS, because I'm just always behind. But it's interesting saying that.
I'm more worried that they're moving to preprocessors that are less smart about CSS. I think CSS and JS, there's people doing good work. I mean, it's fundamentally the same idea. It's just some CSS preprocessing, no problem there. But JavaScript doesn't have these built-in design concepts like relative units or units at all in terms of design units, lengths, Links are not a thing that exist in other languages. Colors are not a thing that exist in other languages. And there's people sort of building these tools, but they're piecemeal, and there's not a language like Sass that will do CSS in JS and be smart about these types. I find it funny. I mean, I think CSS has these important types, these important design types, and everybody's obsessed with TypeScript, but still throws out all these CSS types and replaces them with simple strings. And what we get is we're styling with strings, and we can't manipulate them in any way, the way that we could in Sass. Sass understands what a color is. I can automatically generate color palettes. And I would need some combination of external libraries to pull that off in JavaScript.
Why do you think it is that we encounter these kind of frustrations with CSS and Sass so frequently? Is it because it's so complex and so difficult, or is it because the barrier to entry is so low, so it's easy to be dangerous? Or
I think it's the combination. And I would say what's most complex about it is learning to not be complex about it. I mean, it's sort of that like learning to trust normal flow, learning to trust that it can't look the same in every browser, that it's failing on our behalf for us, and that's a feature. And so these ideas that every time it does something unexpected, we have to fix it, comes from imperative languages where we're in control of the entire system. And I think it's a shift for print designers, and it's also a shift for developers. CSS is unlike either one, and takes its entirely unique mental model. I think we keep applying like object-oriented programming, which is pretty close. I mean, clearly we've named things classes and attributes and inheritance. Like we have object-oriented concepts in CSS, and that makes sense. But then we try functional programming, and I keep thinking it's just so different. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about code. We need a different paradigm for it. We can't keep applying paradigms from languages that work in a fundamentally different way.
Yeah.
So what is Cascade aligned programming? What is that?
Right. I was very entertained that with the face that you pulled when you started talking about weighted influence, and there was certainly a moment when there was like, where does this end? So I kind of have to ask, where do you think that would? I'm trying to imagine the impact for
one of
developers, designers.
Yeah, one of the immediate responses to it was, what if I, as the author, want yellow text on a blue background, 50%, and the user wants blue text on a yellow background, 50%. We average both. What do we get? Green on green?
I don't see a problem with that. I don't see any...
And there were also legal issues that came up. If the user had too much control over font sizes, how do you like have minimum font size for your legal text? That was another issue that was raised with user control. And actually when, so Halcombe Lee made this initial proposal and then worked with Bert Boss, who also had a separate proposal. They worked together first joint proposal to the W3C. And they said that most of the response was just fighting about that issue. How much control do users have was the big fight. And I think my sense is that Halcombe still is a little frustrated that we didn't go with some, I mean, he says in the document, once we do a binary approach, we can't go back. Once it's binary, it's always going to be binary, and we can't add complexity to it. And I think he's still sad about that we went binary. And we'll never get this more complicated. I actually have, though, I mean, I've been playing with these ideas. I love giving control to the users. So like on the Oddbird website and on my website, you can create your own themes, your own styles, changing the colors, changing whether the theme is based on complements or adjacent colors or monochrome, changing the contrast. So I've tried to like implement his idea of sliders where the user is changing the design of the site. And it's not the same half mine, half yours, but it's giving them that control. I think that's fun.
It's a really interesting avenue that I was not expecting to be looking at all as you started your session. Miriam, we're just about out of time, so I just think there's enough time for me just to say thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation and a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it very much indeed.
Great.
Thanks for spending all the time with us.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for coming and asking questions. It was great chatting.
Awesome. Great stuff. All right, well, we'll work our way back over to the stage so I can see clapping happening already without even needing to be asked in the session. So Miriam, thanks again, and talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.